Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in, for keeping the time, and for saving this time to be with us. And COFEM is a coalition of feminists for social change. We come together to do so much together as feminists, including developing knowledge products and doing a few other feminist gatherings. And today, we are also celebrating our Feminist Project Management Learning Brief, which was completed a year plus ago. And this is why Janna and Laura are with us here today to kind of expand on the learnings that we shared the previous time in the learning brief, but also maybe something that has changed for them or something that has advanced for them as they learn more about feminist project management. And what does this mean for our leadership styles? What does it actually mean in practice? And yeah, we thank them so much for gifting us this 1 hour for a free webinar. And so now I will hand over to Laura and Janna, and I will be on the chat. So if you have any questions, I will be present to take them and share them with Laura and Janna as well. And they will be able to respond to them, hopefully. And if not, I am sure they will find a way to get back to them. But for now, over to you.
Thanks so much, Lucky, for getting us started. And also thanks so much for co-hosting this webinar with us together. I hope you can also all see my screen. So hi, everyone, and welcome once more. I guess just as a small side note, we feel quite overwhelmed with the number of registrations for today's webinar and also seeing all of you attending here. So thanks so much for taking the time to be here. We only have 1 hour today, so let's get started. So my name is Janna Visser, and together with Laura Dix, we will take you through this introduction of Feminist Project Management. Laura and I connected around 3 years ago over shared frustrations, as well as our desire for change in project management. We will talk more about this in a few minutes. And I think it was about 3 years ago when we were connected through COFEM. And with the wonderful support of COFEM, we have written the Feminist Project Management Learning Brief, which has launched a little over a year ago. And since then, Laura and I have kept building feminist project management. Amongst others, we have a website now. We have a newsletter to which you can subscribe. We write regular blog posts. And we are also running a feminist project management training course. We are also collaborating with different organizations in terms of co-creating feminist project management organizational models. And we are just really excited to be here a year later and to kind of also give an update of how much our thinking has evolved and changed since then. We'll also put some links in the chat for you to look at, but on the screen you can see a brief overview of what we will touch upon today. So we would like to start with some important scene setting on the problematic history of project management. And from there, we will touch upon some of the common challenges in mainstream project management. We dive into what feminist project management is all about, including its key principles and practices. And we will close off by visualizing some of the impact we believe feminist project management can have. And if time allows, we are really happy to take some questions as well towards the end. So feel free to pop them in the chat as we go. Just a few general notes before we start. So as said, feel free to drop your questions in the chat throughout. And I will share my next slide. So on the screen, you can see some of our ground rules for the shared webinar space as well. Please take care of yourself and others. In this webinar, we are going to talk about the history of project management, which also touches upon slavery, war, and military action. So please take care of yourself with this in mind. We ask you to be curious and listen actively, and we ask you to respectfully and empathetically communicate with each other. Also, please communicate with each other in the chat with kindness. and use possible discomfort to learn. Some topics or practices might be uncomfortable. This is not to say you should sit in that discomfort, but discomfort can mean asking, what does this discomfort mean and what can I learn from it? We also very much welcome your feedback afterwards, but please also let us know if we can adapt something along the way by putting it in the chat. Lucky has been so kind to keep an eye out on the chat with us. And just as a general note, in this webinar, we have tried to replicate the atmosphere we also strive for in our trainings. So we look forward to facilitating an inclusive, interactive, and where possible with this amount of participants, interactive and supportive learning environment. So let's dive into the first part of today's webinar on some of the history of project management. So many of us in the charity and NGO sector use project management on a daily basis in order to manage projects in our organizations. And it seems an unobtrusive framework with which to lead us to getting outcomes on short-term temporary endeavors. However, project management has a troublesome history that is not known, acknowledged, widespread scale. And it's a practice that found its roots in slavery and racism and was further forged within patriarchy and capitalism to get where it is today. In order to manage projects in a way that does not cause harm, we need to examine those roots of project management and consider how they impact our practice today. And we argue completely transform them and show resistance and challenge these practices, tools, and frameworks by using a feminist approach instead. And as Harper and Albrechtston argue, we don't focus enough on dismantling the systems and structures that contribute to marginalization and oppression in the first place, including within our own organization. So within the short webinar, we start this by drawing your attention to the often little known history of project management and its harmful practices.
So hopefully she will be able to screen share in a second. If not, I can pick up and carry on. She did say, will her internet connection hold? Because there's so many people on the call, so we will see. Give it just 1 minute and then otherwise I'll take over.
Hi, so sorry, I dropped off for some weird reason. Let me briefly get into sharing screen mode again. Lucky, can you please make me co-host again?
Absolutely. 1 moment.
Yeah, you dropped off just before slide 5, so I think if you start there, that should.
That's great. Thanks so much.
I was saying that you said about your internet connection with so many people on the call, so yeah.
Right, so let's pick it up where we left it. Are you all able to see my screen again? I see some nodding, that's good. All right, so let's start with some more background of the history of project management. So we begin with managing projects. People have been managing projects for thousands of years, and it's a concept that has been around since ancient civilization. Think about the immense building of the pyramids in Egypt, the Great Wall of China, Angkor Wat, and Stonehenge. Building these would have crossed generations, and some taking hundreds of years to build. However, instead of being known as project managers, these structures were instead seen as acts of worship, engineering, or nation building, carried out by people that called themselves priests, engineers, or architects. And that leads us to project management being a newer concept in itself. Project management, as the framework we know now, began to emerge as a discipline in the USA during the 1940s, was refined during the 50s and 60s as part of advances in the military, the space race, the construction of skyscrapers, and the automotive industry, and more recently has been adopted by the technology sector, where agile ways of working have become the new standards. And it was actually during these phases of project management where a lot of the tools we use nowadays were designed. So that leads us to the question, why is this a problem? So the problem with this is that much of the language, processes, and practices we use today, at least in the West, are built on this history. Many of our tools, processes, and frameworks are rooted in patriarchal, global North values that have historically excluded women, blurred or even cemented oppression, and taken a major focus on productivity and value over people. And we would say that managing project isn't a problem, but project management is. It was designed without humans in mind, and we can still see this ripple effect in our practices today. I would love to hand over to Laura now to dive a little bit deeper into that history to help us better understand it.
Thank you, Janna, and hey everyone. So we know that project management and the role of the project manager, for those of you that do it or are involved in projects, is focused really heavily on timeframes, schedules, this relentless pursuit of outcomes. And there's a lot of centering around productivity within project management. But according to Caitlin Rosenthal, who's a scholar and wrote a book called Accounting for Slavery, one of the most troubling aspects of modern project management is that many of the frameworks and calculations that are used for measuring productivity, optimizing the workforce, and asset depreciation come directly from slavery, so plantation owners during slavery in the US. And that's because within the slavery system, productivity was everything. So one of the principal ways to organize labor under slavery was a quota or task-based system where slaves were assigned a set task or quota to complete by the end of the day. And these tasks were broken down into smaller components, and the time it took for slaves to complete each of those tasks was measured. And this was then tracked using data by plantation owners. And that's actually where the term spreadsheet comes from these huge sheets that they used to record this data on. And that data was benchmarked to create a standard by which others were measured. And if a slave wasn't able to meet this, they were punished, often being beaten or worse. And this system actually allowed plantation owners to identify areas where productivity could be really improved and to incentivize workers to work faster, essentially. So although slavery was abolished in the US in 1865, the practices that were established during slavery paved the way for something called the scientific management movement in America. So some of you may have heard of this before, but if not, in 1911, a man called Frederick Taylor published The Principles of Scientific Management, which was a book really focused on analyzing workflows and methods to find ways to really increase worker productivity. So how do we get the most out of people, and how do we sort of increase this within factories and things like that? So again, Caitlin Rosenthal in her book, Accounting for Slavery, writes a lot about this and writes that actually control was a really central part of scientific management. And there were so many similarities between this system and slavery. Obviously, there was a few that weren't the same, but even down to the language of slavery, it was really similar. So one of Taylor's associates described scientific management as a system that is the relationship of master and slave, regardless of how otherwise it may be named. And it may or may not surprise you to know that a really striking example of scientific management in practice is the Gantt chart. So loads of you may recognize this and use it in your own projects. And the Gantt chart shows a visual representation of progress against time. So lots of project managers use this to track activities on projects. It was developed by a man called Henry Gantt, but he came from a family with a history of slaveholding in Maryland, USA. And the concept of visualizing schedules and resources can be traced back to accounting practices on plantations, where they needed a lot of organization and planning to coordinate kind of large scale operations. So the thinking behind the Gantt chart developed from this plantation economy, and the Gantt chart has its rules in a really exploitative system. And there's also, we'll send you a list of resources after this, but there's academics who argue that Gantt used the chart to kind of measure and then argue for a link between whiteness and efficiency. So if it's not already clear, what we're trying to say is that the current practices in project management and their focus on productivity and kind of products over people have their roots in the system of slavery. So very much treating humans as economic units, controlling and measuring outputs, pushing people harder and harder, which then pushes the baseline of what can be achieved further and further, as well as this models of kind of hierarchical leadership based on power and equality. And we use many of these tools without really knowing or considering their history and what they were designed for. And we argue that this can cause harm in a myriad of ways. So just to touch on, there's another couple of influences on project management that we now know it. So as Janna mentioned, in the kind of 1940s or just before to the 60s, project management became much more refined by the use of it in military projects. So the race for space was a big part of this, but the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb was actually considered kind of the first program, which was like a number of related projects that linked to achieve a specific outcome. And you've got a picture there, if you're not sure, of Cillian Murphy in Oppenheimer, who was the scientist that was in charge of part of the development of the atomic weapons. So project management was then really refined during a period in which where the world was at war and honed to ensure kind of productivity with real military precision, used to create maximum damage by institutions well known to be racist, colonial, sexist, etc. And we believe we can hear how the language of project management has been influenced by this kind of the military. So, for example, many of you may recognize the term execution phase, deadline, target, iron triangle. They're all common, really everyday language in project management that we don't tend to question, that may have sort of been formed through this period. And finally, the influence of the tech sector on project management. So in 2001, there was a manifesto for agile software development, which started a trend towards a very different style of project management. So think Silicon Valley, think quite male-dominated, fast-paced environments that often are about profit over people. And from this period, we can really see language, tools, and practices that have dominated project management processes that are rooted in quite competitive sporting language and patriarchal norms like Scrum Master, kickoff meeting. And you'll notice actually the language is quite ableist. So phrases like agile, stand-up meeting, and sprint, and they all kind of use the language of exclusion. So why is this history important? So there's so much more to the history of project management that we could tell you, including the way that we even define what a project is and how that's really excluded women and people of colour, and how the way projects are actually set up creates competition and compounds inequality. So we've just given you a really brief overview here with lots of pictures of white men. And we delve into this much more in our course. But why is this history important? So we've got here a quote from Laura.
Before you go on, there is a request for you to slow down a bit on the pace as you speak.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
No worries.
Yes, of course. Of course. Thank you for asking. Yeah, so why is this important? So we've got a quote here from Louder Than 10, and which is a really great resource to watch as well. And they say early project management roles supported systems of oppression, and we designed these tools to help us be more productive. So it's now difficult to use them without doing harm. And what we aim to show is that managing projects isn't the problem, but the project management frameworks that we use are, because they have these roots in colonial, Western, patriarchal, ableist cultures. And crucially, project management has come from industries where projects were focused on things like construction, industry, war, technology. And for those of us working in humanitarian projects, we work alongside people. And we believe that we can't use these frameworks that come from these industries without doing harm. So as feminists, we need to find ways to challenge, dismantle, resist these practices and offer new ways of managing projects that fit with our feminist values. But how do we do this? So we're going to explore a feminist way of managing projects shortly. But first, we want to hear from you. So Janna mentioned at the beginning that we connected over shared frustrations and challenges about project management. And as we spoke more together, we realized that we both wanted to work on projects in a way that aligns with values around feminist leadership and bring these to life through project management. but we experienced barriers even in the way that project management is set up. The existing tools and structures we were using didn't allow space for working in a feminist way. And we were both leading projects and participating in ones that are led by others that we felt could look really different. So we believe that many of you joining us today are here because you also face challenges within mainstream project management, and perhaps you want to manage projects differently too. So we want to hear from you. What are the main challenges that you face in project management within the projects you lead on or participate in? So we'd love to hear from you in the chat. We'll give you a few minutes to respond. What are the main challenges that you face in project management, either projects that you lead on or that you participate in? Give a few minutes for you to start writing. Ways we have some coming in. There's never enough time to do what needs to be done. I completely agree. We've done this webinar twice now, or a similar one, and time, pace comes up every time. I have to try and make sure I go through these quickly. Measuring impact is a huge challenge. Ask and provide quantitative data, but so much of we do what cannot be measured in numbers. Completely agree. Focus on timelines. Staff are stressed and overworked. 100%. That comes up every time. It doesn't reflect our work. Unrestricted power of commissioners and funders. Yeah. That sense of trying to bridge donor requirements. Yeah. Yeah. Unpredictable security issues and conflicts. Yeah, absolutely. We're not managing projects in tech, or we're working with people. You know, some NGOs work in conflict zones, and there's a lot. Yeah, a huge thing about balancing donors and funders, making rooms for mistakes and acceptance. Yeah. Amount of time that I spend on measuring progress. Yes, I completely agree. There's a huge emphasis on progress and always kind of producing, isn't there, within project management? There's loads coming in, so I don't know that I can mention all. I'll just try and mention ones that haven't been said. So focus on doing instead of recognizing the humans doing. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, calling the team project resources. I feel exactly the same. We talk about resource allocation and things, don't we? Which is, yeah, really problematic. They're people. Project timelines are problematic. What impact that's more meaningful to us and the actual communities? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, who makes decisions and who's in charge? I can see loads coming in here about outcomes as well. Human resources limited. Yeah. The amount of donors are just coming up over and over again. Burn rate versus impact created. Yeah. Women being the de facto administrators or housekeepers. Yeah, that's really interesting. Dealing with conflict and resolving conflict seen as a soft issue. Yeah, absolutely. So how gender and gender roles are kind of displayed within project management is really interesting. I think Rita's put this about how risk management versus real life is very different. We can project so much. Unequal partnerships, inability to meaningfully collect with local partners. Yeah. Or often because timeframes are really short, aren't they? I've worked on projects where it's only 1 year and funders expect you to get all set up and do meaningful work in this time, but that's someone else has just put, yeah, not enough space to make processes participatory. So completely agree. So we know, keep them coming, please, because there's lots that we've seen, and like I said, there's a real sense of shared frustration, I think, around project management and how it is. So I'll move on. But so we know that there's a ton of challenges within project management practice now, and part of the problem is that we've adopted this project management framework as good practice, despite the problematic history. And we may think, as Janna said, that it's just a framework that helps us get from A to B. But we do really need to challenge some of these approaches and tools and things within project management. So we've heard these challenges and we know that people want to lead differently. So what could a feminist way of managing projects look like? And this is something that Janna and I have been absolutely building since the last learning brief that we did, and we're still building, to be honest. We're learning all the time, and this is so helpful to hear from you as well. But just some of the things that we've pulled out that are important. So feminist project management centers process as well as progress. So modern project management or mainstream project management is all about progress, and it's things like care and reflection are often forgotten. There's all of this focus on kind of doing and reaching the goals or the targets that we have or the KPIs. And there's little focus on actually how we get there. So many staff, and ourselves included, have talked about feeling stressed, exhausted, burnt out. There's no real focus within project management on care or what it might even look like to work with trauma. So many NGOs are running projects working in war zones or with domestic abuse survivors. And actually, what does that look like when you are working in projects and adds this level of kind of stress and so feminist project management is as much about how we're getting there as what we're getting there to, what are our outcomes. So again, this link to productivity culture and mainstream project management, and some of you may recognize this idea of the tyranny of the urgent. So everything's important. You've got a huge to-do list. The pace feels really fast. And often things have been inadequately or incorrectly estimated. So you've got unrealistic timeframes in which to do things. And that may come from funders and their expectations, or it may come from internally and actually things having not been really thought through in terms of how long a task takes. So actually what we want to see in feminist project management is collaborative benchmarking that allows for healthy and inclusive workflows. We've written a blog post about this, so we've put the links in the chat, but within mainstream project management, projects often have linear, rigid stages. So within things like PMBOK or Prince2, you have these 5 or 7 stages that a project goes through. And in an organization, projects kind of pop up and then they go, and they pop up and then they go, whether it's a year or 3 years projects. And there doesn't seem to be much of a thread between them. Whereas in feminist project management, we think projects should have a flow and they should be much more circular in learning and in growth. And we don't necessarily go through them in a linear way. You know, if things aren't working, then you go back to your planning and your kind of your initial part, rather than planning just being something that comes at the beginning and then finishes. One of the main issues around project management is that it's really hierarchical as well. So the mainstream model is that it's run by a single project manager. So you have this power really centralized at the top. And often you find quite unhealthy power dynamics within project management, when actually we want to shine a light on what projects could look like if they're run differently. So there's lots of examples where projects are run as collectives, or even that different kind of leaders step forwards at different stages of a project, which is really interesting kind of way of flipping this and challenging it. The other thing that lots of people tend to mention is that mainstream project management can be really bureaucratic. So there's often loads of setup paperwork, there's loads of meetings that happen, and it just feels like there's generating paperwork after paperwork, and actually it's sometimes quite unhelpful. So we think feminist project management should just have really context-specific documentation that's just relevant and effective, and including within that things like meetings and emails. And finally, projects are often framed as something that only organisation led, and this really kind of rigid model. Whereas for us, we think projects can be personal, they can be voluntary, they can be organisational. Things like planning a wedding is a project, you know, planning to redecorate your house, or doing all sorts of kind of community events. They're all projects, and actually we really want to challenge the way that projects have been framed. So I've given a bit more of an overview, and we're going to delve a little bit more into what exactly feminist project management looks like for us. So I'll pass you back to Janna And please let us know still if there's anything that you need. So about pace of speaking and things, it's really helpful.
Thanks, Laura, for setting the scene. So yeah, let's take a deeper dive into what feminist project management means for us. So we have formulated 6 foundational principles that form our underlying approach to feminist project management. You can also see them on the screen. I will just briefly talk you through them. So the first principle is the no one size fits all. There is just no one set in stone approach to feminist project management. I know this is always a little bit disappointing as well, but we really think it's an ongoing process of learning and unlearning, both individually as well as collectively. All projects are different. However, we do believe that there are certain values and practices that are key in practicing it. And that is exactly what we're going to zoom in on in this second half of the webinar. The second principle is project leadership is diverse. As just mentioned by Laura, anyone can practice feminist project management, whether the project is a small personal endeavor or an ambitious national program. We also believe that projects can be run as collectives where there are multiple people leading, or even radical models where different people or teams lead different parts, rather than just the dominant mainstream version with one project manager from the beginning to end. The third principle is progress and process. Feminist project management is not only about the outcomes. In the rush to deliver, the focus is often placed on outcomes and little attention is paid to how we meet them. And feminist project management really stresses the importance of being conscious about the process of a project and challenging that oppressive productivity culture. The fourth principle is sharing power. Feminist project management centers power dynamics. We promote models of shared decision-making and overall sharing and building power with others, including a feminist approach to accountability. It should be intersectional by design. So unless we build projects around the most marginalized, they will never be fully inclusive. It's about creating project structures and systems that work for everyone involved. And the second principle is courage. Swimming upstream to work in a different way can be difficult. And feminist project management really is about being courageous to throwing off old ways of working and embracing transformative project management practices. So it's about courage to resist to work in a mainstream way, but also courage to challenge those norms and systems that don't work for everyone involved. And with feminist project management, we focus both on equipping individual project managers to manage projects differently from their position, as well as pushing for a wider system change. I think the 6 principles I just mentioned are interwoven through our entire approach to leading projects. But I guess after seeing a list of principles, the question always remains, so how do we apply this in our day-to-day project management? And that's something we explore in very practical terms also in our training course, because the principles are applied through 4 practices that we also centralize, which will Laura tell more about in a second. But let's dive deeper into just one of these principles for now, and let's focus on progress and process. So we talked about how mainstream project management focus often on progress, but what does this look like? What might go wrong if we focus on progress? So a sole focus on progress might lead to the productivity culture that was mentioned before. So rushing into execution without adequately planning or outlining the steps needed to achieve the project's goals and attaching realistic planning to it. Focusing solely on getting tasks done without documenting processes, decisions, and outcomes can result in a lack of institutional memory, making it not only difficult to track progress, but also risk sustainability of a project on multiple levels. For example, to replicate parts of the projects in the future or to build on the project as time passes and teams might rotate. There's also a risk of focusing solely on individual contributions without considering team dynamics, communication, and collaboration, which can lead to conflicts and moral issues. So a good project, perhaps the projects that we are co-creating with the communities, take a longer time to set up, but it will build trust and contribute to different types of collaboration than we are often used to within the scope of project management. And a final challenge is lack of adaptation. So being overly rigid and sticking to initial plans without being open to adjusting strategies based on changing circumstances or the context. So as these challenges demonstrate, progress and process are both key because they simply work in tandem. So process is really about the how of running projects. And on the slide, you can see a few tips for practice. So one way we could practically implement a focus on process is having process as a defined outcome, just as we do with tasks around progress. It's important to engage the project team at the start, but definitely also throughout a project in determining the how of reaching those objectives. And one way of doing that can be brainstorming about potential process outcomes collaboratively. Amongst others, think about how you want to collaborate as a team, how you'd like to communicate with each other, how you share power within projects, but also how you take care of yourself and others. I think there are many more examples of how to put more focus on the process of a project. And we are also, again, very curious to hear from you. How do you pay attention to process in your ongoing projects? I'll just briefly pause here before handing back over to Laura and give you some time to write some answers in the chat. See some comments coming in. Please keep them coming. Joanna saying paying attention to process is painful because there is so much focus on progress. That's so recognizable, unfortunately. And I guess that really links also back again to the sense of urgency that's always there within the scope of project. Like there's never enough or sufficient time to really check in with each other on the process or on mental health or more on a personal level. Laura is saying, I always ask my partners if they agree with deadlines and if they have suggestions or modifications they want to make. I think that's a very important one. And really about co-creating the planning and attaching deadlines to it that works for everyone involved in a project. Feedback integration. I love that one. I think it's always fascinating to see how we always think about feedback, usually towards the end of a project, while feedback is so important throughout as well. Being mindful of how processes are being undertaken. Definitely already thinking that through from the start and not just as an afterthought. Rita is saying process is complex. It includes human beings, what is emerging and what are we learning from what is emerging and how we are looping that into our work. Definitely, especially working with people makes that we also can't plan everything from the start of a project onwards and that we need to create time and a space to reflect on what is emerging and adapt from there. Also love how you centralize learning in that. I think that's also something that usually comes towards the end of a project or is not captured at all. See another one, a continuous feedback loop on the process from the partners. Building in time for process into project timelines is tricky, but we seek to do it wherever we can. I think that's also the reality of working with people and working with different partners, and also sometimes just having that timeline or deadline that you need to stick to. But seeking those elements where we can tweak the process in, I think is really key. Keeping communication channels open is also one that I like very much. That one will also come back when we touch a bit more about the practices. Participatory processes support collective accountability and setting goals that we all have a stake in, definitely. I see loads more coming in. Thanks so much, and please keep them coming. A lot of these reflections, I think, also link back really concretely to the 4 practices that we centralize within the Feminist Project Management model, which will Laura tell you a bit more about.
Yes. So just thinking a bit more about like the how of feminist project management. So the thoughts just occurred to me that we started trying to think about what managing projects from a feminist perspective would look like. And we kept trying to kind of adapt current project management cycles and the tools and thinking, oh, can we kind of shove feminism in somewhere? But as our thinking has evolved, we just absolutely believe that project management as a practice should be kind of dismantled itself completely. And instead, our approach is much more kind of values led rather than thinking about timelines or these stages or anything like that. So these are the 4 building blocks which we offer to you that we think forms kind of key practices for feminist project management. And if we use the principles that Janna just talked about as this kind of base approach to work from, the next step is using these kind of building blocks as a more tangible way to practice feminist project management. So the first is reflection. And we chose reflection because operationalizing this work is really hard and we don't always get things right. But from a feminist perspective, recognizing elements that we need to unlearn as well as relearn is really important. So having continuous learning and reflection in our projects helps us unpick practices that don't serve us, as well as shines a light on those that do. And in our course, we talk a lot more about how you can really implement reflection, because I know that time often doesn't feel like we have space to do this well. So we talk a lot about how that can be put in place. Collaboration is key. So power runs through all of these key practices, and we talk about power a lot on the training, but it's really important when we're collaborating. So some people have mentioned it already in the chat. Whose voices do we hear when we set up projects? Whose voices are loudest when we're in meetings? And whose lives do we center when we're designing our outcomes? Finding ways of sharing power when we collaborate with others and being transparent about power where and when we have it is really key. So we talk a lot again about collaboration on the course. Communication, so it's always talked about within project management, and they say that knowledge is power, but thinking about the dynamics around communication and working out how to transform these is a big part of our approach. And actually, in some contexts, some project managers have a lot of power over their projects, can really sort of make change here. So finally, care is really central to feminist project management. So whether we are working on projects that involve working alongside people who've experienced trauma or not, centering well-being is a really political act, because we're finding ways to radically transform how we work on projects. So rather than it being focused on productivity and value, we find ways instead to build relationships and increase sustainability for ourselves in this work. So in our course, we dive much more into these and how they really challenge and resist current project management practice. So they're not as straightforward as they sound. And it's not just about things like, for example, thinking about care. So you can't just pop a check-in with your team at the beginning of a project meeting. That doesn't work like that. It's about looking structurally beyond that to consider how power and oppression are operating. So how does power intersect with care on your project? What does care look like, and who can access care? So it also doesn't look like inserting transparency by using something like a RACI matrix to make roles and responsibilities clear. So some of you may have heard in project management or use RACI matrix, which stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. So yes, it clears up transparency about who does what. But with feminist project management, we need to be looking into the real detail about roles and responsibilities to look at who is doing what kinds of labour, what is visible, what is invisible, who is taking on the kind of work that is celebrated and promotable, and whose role is defined by work that is seen as part of their identity. So caring work for women, and people had mentioned this already about administration for women, or caring work and like DEI work for Black and marginalised women. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into just one practice, which is care. And as we found out when we spoke to so many of you, the big challenge is that product management is all about productivity. And many of us find that our well-being is really impacted by the speed at which we're working and the rate at which we're expected to perform, which creates stress. And as well as working in spaces where there's trauma, it's also acknowledging that there's trauma inherent to different communities, for example, racial trauma. So many of us already know that self-care is radical, but in the context of project management, it's direct resistance to this productivity and urgency and pace and everything that's problematic about project management. So we cover care a lot more in our course, but again, we would like to hear from you. So what are some ideas that you have about how to implement care when managing or participating in projects? So yeah, we'd love to hear from you. What are some ideas that you have about how to implement care when managing or participating in projects? I'm sure there'll be some really, really lovely ideas from this group. Thank you so much for your contribution so far as well. I found every time we've done this webinar, people really enjoy being in a space with other people who've really shared their sort of these shared frustrations, and it's exactly how Janna and I met. So it's really interesting, and we feel really seen by you as well. So this is great. So some stuff's coming in. So asking people before a project starts what their preferred working styles and their support needs. I love that. Absolutely. Team building sessions away from desks. Yeah. Giving people space to share what's going on in their lives rather than jumping into the agenda. Yeah, that's lovely. I love that. Oh, rejuvenating space. Thank you. Flexible working. We're going to collate all of these as well, so don't worry if we don't get a chance to talk about all of them. But feedback, yeah, that's coming up a lot, which is great. Being kind, celebrating both successes and failures. Yeah, absolutely. If you don't win, you learn. I think I love that phrase. Empathy. Play-based methods. I love that. And taking time to build relationships. Absolutely. One of my main issues, I think, with project management, I think, as I said, is that we don't get enough time to really have that setup phase. And that is so important of building this trust, building what we want the project to look like. So amazing. Organizational culture, encourage self-care, take lunch. Absolutely. I love it. So I'm going to keep going because I'm just thinking about time for questions if there are any. But please keep popping your ideas in about care, which there's some lovely ones on there. We just wanted to share a few from us that we've learned. So we talked earlier about how the baselines can be really problematic within project management, and we don't estimate correctly how much time things take. So if you're in a position where you're planning a project, make sure you include annual leave, bank holidays, buffer against sick days, things like carers allowance, all of those things, so that you have this kind of buffer against unexpected delays within your project. And it's much easier for you to be able to kind of, I suppose the pace is less pressured. Some of you may be able to have a budget for care for the team, or maybe able to push for that, which is really helpful. And one of the things we didn't hugely go into, but I know in the UK, and I work in the sector, so it's a lot of women who are on really precarious kind of, 1 year projects, and then you always come to the end and you're not really sure what's happening with your role. You've got to find somewhere else. So although Janna and I want to challenge that at a much higher level, the things that you can do within the project are actually write testimonials for each other at the end, or update CVs together if that's appropriate, to really highlight strengths and skills that you've learned during the project to help with that kind of career instability and thinking about the new role. And the final thing is include well-being on your risk assessment. So it's really important that this is really top of, the conversations that we're having about the pace of work and how that's affecting your team. So there's just a few from us, as I said, there's loads more that we go on our course, but I hope you've walked through just some ideas about how you can begin to transform your projects. So I'll pass back to Janna for the last part.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks also everyone for sharing in the chat. As Laura said before, it is also for us always very validating to see all those interactions in the chat and see all that recognition. I think having a space to share and find like-minded people and think about ways to challenge some of these practices is really inspirational for us as well. So thanks for that. I think we are running a bit short on time, and we actually have loads more to share about feminist project management, specifically about its application and what it can look like in practice in different contexts. But what we would like for you to take with from today's webinar is that there are ways to dismantle and resist mainstream project management frameworks and practices. And we really hope that with this webinar and with the principles and practices shared today, and also from all the reflections in the chat, we gave you some inspiration on how to do it differently. I think feminist project management to us really is about opening up space to manage differently. For example, having multiple project managers on a project, sharing power across the project team, defining success both in terms of outcomes and process. It's about challenging oppressive project management structures. So feminist project management is does not only offer a deeper structural understanding of how gender and other oppressive systems are playing out in projects, but also offers those practical tools and ways of managing to counter this. And finally, projects being run more aligned to feminist values. So despite challenges, feminist project management enables project managers to manage projects in alignment with feminist principles, even in non-feminist contexts, amongst others through identifying where you hold influence as a project manager and to offer those practical examples and tools to use this influence for transformation. And I think just to reiterate that we really agree with the louder than dense message that we created this system, so we also have the power to change it. And that is what we really want to create with feminist project management. So as a close-off, we really invite you to be part of this change with us. And there are different ways to continue your journey into feminist project management with us, which we will share in the chat. But for now, I would also like to highlight one specific opportunity. So if you are looking for practical support on how to practice feminist project management and looking for a community of like-minded practitioners, we really invite you to sign up for the Feminist Project Management course. Our training course runs for 3 weeks with one session of 3 hours each week. And during the training course, we will dive into how you identify power, what your power is, and how you can share power as a feminist project manager. We will also explore what a feminist approach to collaboration and communication looks like, including decision-making and accountability. And we will look into different ways of weaving in self and collective care in projects. So in our course, we really dismantle the idea of project management and offer ways to resist and challenge dominant project management practices and tools, and really equip with new ways to manage projects that align to our feminist values. And next to that, we offer a space for connection and exchange to also learn from each other. So bookings are now open for our September cohort, taking place on September 10, 17, and 24. And we have a special offer for everyone on this webinar. If you book your spot before coming Friday, so July 12th, you receive 40% discount on the course. If you have any doubt whether the course is for you, feel free to reach out via email. We are happy to answer any questions you might have. Before we move on to an official closure of today's webinar, we would also like to know from you, what is the one thing that you will take away from our webinar today? Please feel free to share some of your answers in the chat. see some different reflections coming in. That project management can and should be done differently. Definitely. We are not alone in these challenges, and there is a way to work from a different paradigm. I love that. Affirmation that there is a different way to manage projects and work with people, and that others are also interested in finding a different norm. Definitely. Gratitude for all the work done and hope for change in workspaces. I love that one. We should have that hope for change as well and find our ways to push that further. Feminists and project managers around the world need to find more ways to connect and learn from each other. Definitely, that one brings with me as well. I think that's also one of the reasons why Laura and I love to do these webinars and bring loads of people together and also have these rich exchanges in the chats. Collaboration takes intention and planning, absolutely. The key practices reflect, communicate, care, and collaborate. A sense that a different way is possible. I see loads more coming in. Please feel free to drop them as we go. I see we have 1 minute left. Maybe Laura, also over for you to see if we can still maybe take 1 or 2 questions before we log off.
Yeah, so Lucky has collated a couple. I can just see 2, I think, that haven't been answered. So someone, I think, is a really good question. How can we implement a feminist project management approach, I think, in the institutions we work, regardless of their nature, whether public, private, or NGO? And I can come in on that first. So I think it can feel really hard, especially when we're not in leadership positions, to think about creating change. And I think there's definitely something about starting small and thinking about the steps that you can take from your role within that one project. And in our course, we actually really talk about this. We talk about this thing called the space in between, where it's very much, you know, there's a way that you want to work and then the way that you are working or the context that you're in. So how do you manage that space in between? And it's a real thing, you know, we really understand that frustration. We've both felt it as well. I don't know, Janna, if you want to sort of follow up with that as well.
I think these are some really good suggestions. I think also just a recognition that doing this work and trying to lead projects from a different way can be challenging. And I think that's also definitely why we centered courage as one of the principles, especially in contexts that are less feminist or not feminist at all. It can sometimes take a lot and be an extra challenge to drive and push for those changes. I think one thing that has helped us tremendously as well, especially also when we were still working in different contexts, is to also really find those feminist allies out there, both within the organization, but also outside the organization. And to also really share with each other what are the challenges, but also to hear from others what innovative ways they use. So yeah, please also find yourself that community of like-minded practitioners, and know you're not alone. I think if anything, today's chat webinar validated that we are with many that would love to change the ways of working within the scope of project management.
I think the only other question, I know people have got to go, so I think someone said, where can we find more info about the course? So we've put a link to our website in the chat. And then kind of follow-up webinar be held, sharing and exploring this is super useful. So thank you for that feedback. Yeah, it's lovely to hear that you want to know more. So yeah, that's great. I know we'll follow everything else up in the chat, I think, so I'm just mindful of time. Sorry for sending out afterwards. But yeah, any questions, please do pop questions in the chat still, and any that we haven't answered we'll send around along with the slides. So
just checking maybe with Lucky as well, if you want to say some final words before we close off. But thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today and being on this journey with us.
Hi, Laura and Janna and everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here from the start to the end. And thank you so much for the engagement on the chat. and sharing all your work and challenges and hopes. And I truly hope that this webinar was as really great and helpful for you as it was for me. I know that Laura and Janna shared links to their websites and their social media LinkedIn page. Also, if you are interested, please visit the CoFem website. I shared that as well. And you too could be a member, and it's one of the communities that you can join that has amazing people doing amazing work. And for the question about doing this webinar again, I think that we will explore opportunities with CoFem and see what's possible. If it is possible, then we will have a follow-up webinar that would be courtesy of CoFem. But otherwise, we'll explore all the opportunities with the amazing Laura and Janna. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.